Hello, welcome to Origin Story. In each episode, we take an idea, figure, or event from history, we explain its origins, and we talk about how it influences political discourse today. I'm Dorian Linsky, author of The Ministry of Truth and Everything Must Go.
And my name is Ian Dunt. I am a columnist with the newspaper and the author of the Striking 13 newsletter.
So you join us for the third and final part of the story of the British Labour Party. We did not leave them on a high. The 1979 election, another existential crisis for Labour, of which there have been many, and we're probably living through one right now. Membership immediately craters in 1 year from 660,000 to 348,000. It's not that thing where people let's rally around the defeated party. It's like, oh, fuck this then. It has never got back to where it was in 1979. So it's a similar problem to what they had in the 1950s, where they seem out of touch with the aspirational mood that Thatcher didn't create. It was already building up. You can see all this evidence. The historian Andy Beckett points out, it was all over the place in the late 70s. And now it can't deliver redistribution through growth, Keynesian bargain. So it doesn't have a really strong economic argument against Thatcherism. And in fact, Dennis Healey, who we talked about, the outgoing chancellor, he noticed that a lot of working class Labour voters he spoke to were talking about benefit scroungers. They supported cuts.
Right.
They were the kind of people that probably voted for Thatcher. And this becomes a bit of a problem, which Tony Benn, the big figure on the left, refuses to acknowledge. So there's this MP Joe Ashton. He says, the trouble with Tony is that he idealises the working class, and there are as many shits in the working class as there are in the middle class. I know, because I'm in the working class.
Just another fantastic merch opportunity. Who wants to walk around in a T-shirt saying there are as many shits in the working class as the middle class?
But this idea that we have that, sort of Labour is suddenly losing its working class base, it's like this has been a concern for a very long time.
Yeah.
Now, outgoing Prime Minister James Callaghan admits years later that he didn't realise what Thatcher realised, that voters who had no memory of the Great Depression, of wartime central planning, were now much more concerned by inflation than by mass unemployment. It's this major switch in the priorities we discussed in the Thatcherism episode. Turned out people didn't really care about massive unemployment figures after all.
And we should say that we've talked about this many times, but in the division between right and left, or the sort of Hayekian and Keynesian economics, is this emphasis on the left. And the Keynesian side, you care much more about unemployment. Yep. And on the right, you care much more about inflation. And where the public mood swings to one of those, typically speaking, that's where the ideologues will be able to sort of make some progress.
So Labour's priorities and their solutions were both suddenly out of date. Plus, changing demographics. There's a famous essay by the communist historian Eric Hobsbawm in 1978, The Forward March of Labour Halted, ? In 1931, manual workers were 70% of the population, but by then they were only 55%, and working class identity had eroded. It had a lot more segmented, a lot more class conscious. A little over half of union members voted Labour in 1979. So he said, this is actually a demographic existential crisis. Right. And that I think is often the case. We talk over and over, and we're talking about it now, about leaders. If you replace Starmer, then things will change. And going all the way back to, I think R.H. Tawney in the 30s said, look, people are blaming Labour's problems on Ramsay MacDonald. But actually, these were kind of structural. These were much deeper in the party. It's not just one guy who messes everything up.
Yeah.
One Labour activist says, we've got to change the image of the Labour Party. It's too much identified with the cloth cap, the industrial worker. We've got to get out and reach people in some of the upmarket, posher areas, or we shall just become a party of the ghetto. Weird use of the word ghetto there. But you see the point. So like Clement Attlee did after the 1951 defeat, Callaghan stays on as leader to try and let things calm down and make sure that Dennis Healey becomes the leader. He's the obvious heavyweight. He's been chancellor. He's been defence secretary. Fortunately, he's also hated by the left. Tony Benn, meanwhile, is hated by the right. He refuses to join the shadow cabinet and tours the country denouncing the leadership. He actually gets as much press as Thatcher. I think it's hard for people who, I wasn't old, old enough to clock this, but I think it's hard for people now to realise just what a huge figure he was and hugely divisive. He goes around pledging to nationalise the banks, abolish the Lords, leave the EEC, obviously. As a result of this friction, the last two conferences where Callaghan is leader are absolutely horrible. And There's a lot to do with like rules changes. So they're changed to give more power to the members, like mandatory deselection for MPs who don't support what the members have decided.
Yeah, we should say that the left sort of push throughout this period places a very heavy emphasis on the membership, in the ultimately actually quite mistaken belief that the membership will always support the left.
Right.
You know, that's always the path forward. So actually, when it turns out to be far more complicated than that and not quite as easy to predict. But that's the real emphasis, is give the power to the members, let them deselect the MPs, you know, let the members take control over the Labour leader if they're not radical enough, over the parliamentary party if they're not radical enough, and over policy.
So Shirley Williams, who we talked about before, more on the right of the party, complains at this conference about a fascism of the left. While Roy Jenkins delivers a landmark lecture about strengthening the radical centre. This is quite a big feature of our Centrism origin story book. And he realises this. I mean, it's clear that that's not possible inside Labour. At this point, he doesn't say he's going to set up a new party, but obviously it's not going to happen within Labour. Then the 1981 leadership election is basically the reverse of 1976. So Dennis Healey wins the first ballot, but Michael Foot from the left narrowly wins the second. And he is the man on the left who is not Tony Benn, which makes him, in this particular point in time, the unity candidate.
Right.
Talk a little bit about Michael Foot, because, you know, I remember having a pretty dim opinion of him growing up because he was so battered by the press. So Foot and Benn, they're basically two kinds of left. That's why it's simplistic to just say there's the right and the left. Foot is a sort of romantic, he's a historian, he's rooted in the whole tradition of Labour, going back through like George Lansbury and Keir Hardie, that kind of Labour leader, to the 19th century socialism of William Morris. Benn is, at this point, more abstract and structural and transactional and sort of aggressively modern, which is funny because he ages into exactly that kind of romantic, right? But at this point, it's much harder. It's about grabbing the machinery of power. Biographer Ken Morgan says, Foot sees British socialism as the custodian of a culture. Benn sees it as a weapon to be mobilised for social transformation. Foot is almost surreally decent and keen to work with people. He makes you wonder if it's possible to be too decent on a human level. He even gets on with figures on the hard right, like Lord Beaverbrook, the newspaper magnate, and Enoch Powell.
Yeah, no, that's too decent.
You've
been too decent.
A little less friendly. And he hates groups like Militant. You're going to explain a lot more about Militant, right? But they're a faction. They've been around since 1964 on the very hard sort of Trotskyist left.
Why don't we just introduce them now? I mean, they're a Trotskyist group that basically intends to get inside of Labour and try to, well, essentially take power that way. And of course, by virtue of that, you have the implicit lie of Trotskyism, right? Which was, well, if the people were really behind you, you wouldn't need to get inside of Labour. You'd just be able to go to the public with your electoral proposition. But of course, you know that you'll never be supported. So your way is to take people who can potentially be elected and just insert yourself into the party. Use those deselection programmes for MPs and see if you can just get your guys into those positions and start to take over the party. And actually, for a period, not quite yet, but over these years, they're actually surprisingly effective at doing that.
This is why the Labour right and centre are just obsessed to this day with entryism.
Yes.
That's what this is. But Foot is really reluctant to sort of crack down too hard because he remembers the divisions. He's old enough, you know, he's been around for yonks. So he remembers the divisions of the 30s and the 50s. He doesn't want to get into purges. He's got a massive problem. Brian Walden, the TV presenter we mentioned, was a Labour MP and a speechwriter for Hugh Gates School. This is really shit you don't get anymore. In a TV interview, paraphrases Hamlet and asks if there was something rotten in the state of the Labour Party. And Foot replies by quoting Hamlet, "Cursed spite that ever I was born to set it right."
That's amazing.
It's just good old-fashioned highbrow political interviewing. Try that on Laura Kunsberg. This is really Tony Benn's last stand as a serious contender. He has become a hero to the younger figures on the left who are largely involved in London politics. You've got Ken Livingstone and John McDonnell at the Greater London Council, the GLC. You've got future MPs Jeremy Corbyn and Diane Abbott as activists in London. All children of the new left. They want to incorporate movements like feminism, anti-racism, anti-apartheid, gay rights, broader civil liberties. The tabloids dub them the loony left. And so-called Red Ken, as Ken Livingstone became known, replaces Benn as the right-wing press's socialist villain, eventually. One union leader And remember, again, that the unions are not necessarily on the left. It says Labour is full of terrorists, lesbians and other queer people. It's not a construction that makes any sense. There's a fascinating character, a right-wing MP and NEC member called John Golding, who is basically the Morgan McSweeney of his day,
right?
The left basher-in-chief. He says, Ben was God's greatest gift to Thatcher and he had to be stopped if Labour was to survive. Harold Wilson, I think a little more wittily, asked about Ben, says, he immatures with age. So Ben wins a big victory with the Campaign for Labour Party Democracy, that organisation set up to do what you said, change the machinery. There's a special conference at Wembley in early 1981 where they introduced the Electoral College for leadership elections, which no longer exists but held for quite a long time. So it's 40% unions, 30% members, 30% MPs. And this is the last straw for the centrists. This spurs the Limehouse Declaration and the formation of the SDP. That's by Roy Jenkins, Shirley Williams, David Owen and Bill Rogers, the Gang of Four. It's a lot in our book. I don't know if we've done it. We must have done it in Thatcherism, right? It's such a kind of landmark event, throws politics into turmoil for a couple of years.
This is but this is anyone on the centre of politics or the centre left, just breaking off from Labour, giving up in the way that the left usually talks of giving up on the party, when the right just say, no, it can't be fixed, it can't be reformed, we have to make a wholly new proposition. And at the time, channeling this sense of real excitement, right? Because there were so many people.
Imagine Change UK, but it worked for a bit.
But the electoral proposition was so much clearer. For so many people, it was like, well, obviously I can't vote for this bunch of commies, hippies over here, but I don't really like that, they're just beating up miners and this, vicious, greedy, capricious sort of attitude from number 10 either. So you could see where there was a pretty big chunk of the country who could be attracted to that kind of party.
And they were the only Europhiles.
Right, yeah.
And so they form an alliance with the Liberals. I was going to say Lib Dems, but obviously the Lib Dems come out of that alliance eventually. They're joined by a couple of dozen more Labour MPs, and one recruit, not an MP, but an important figure, was Michael Young, the author of the 1945 Labour Manifesto. Callaghan is even talking about a coalition with the SDP at the next election, which reminds Tony Benn of which year, do you think?
Oh, no, 1931.
1931.
Of course.
You play the 1931 drinking game with the Benn diaries. So crunch time is the deputy leadership contest in September 81. It's between Dennis Healey and Tony Benn. And as we know, it's not an important job, but it is hugely symbolic. The contest gets really vicious. Healey gets booed and heckled by the hard left. Benn refuses to denounce them, even though they're actually not particularly Benn supporters either. The left-wing MP, Chris Mullen, calls it the most intense power struggle I have ever witnessed.
God, and for nothing.
Deputy leadership.
Yeah.
So this is the origin of the faction that we call the soft left, right? The phrase actually seems to have come from Harold Wilson in 1976, and he meant himself, Michael Foot and Barbara Castle. So that was his sort of idea of what the soft left was. Here it's most of the Tribune group of left-wing MPs, but not left-wing enough for Ben, led by Neil Kinnock.
Yeah.
First, they run a spoiler candidate, and then they abstain in the final round, which is crucial because Ben wins 78% of the members, but Healey wins overall by 50.4% to 49.6%.
It's really canny backstage kind of Machiavellian manoeuvring, especially by Kinnock, that has managed to get them to this point.
So there is this enormous sense of betrayal. Now, this probably, I think, stops more MPs defecting to the SDP, and possibly the SDP, than overtaking Labour. People go, oh, okay, Healey's there. It's not Ben. But the Bennite left screams betrayal. Margaret Beckett, who we know as a figure in New Labour at the time, a Ben supporter, throws silver coins at Kinnock as a Judas reference.
My God, really?
Yeah.
Jesus Christ.
Really nasty. This is sort of primal grudge. You sometimes wonder why the hard left hates the soft left. And that's one of the reasons. They go, when it comes down to it, you'll stitch us up. So Ben leaves the Tribute group and founds the Socialist Campaign group of MPs, which Corbyn came through, and Abbott and McDonnell, and is still around now. He says, you can't go on forever calling yourself a socialist party when you are not. But he sort of agrees to like a truce between the right and the left after this contest. He says, look, a Labour government is better than a Thatcher government. which is
congratulations.
It's a fair point. We have to face the fact that we want a Labour victory. We have to trundle those awful old duds in the shadow cabinet back into Whitehall offices.
It's another winning election slogan from Tony Benn.
I don't think he was saying that on the stump. I hope not. So the election in June 1983. Labour famously gets smashed with 27.6%, which is the worst since 1918, the fewest seats since 1935, only about 2 points ahead of the SDP in vote share, much more in seats because of first past the post fuckery.
Right.
Which is the other thing that's come up as much as 1931. To this day, because I read a recent history of the Labour left, the left blames the SDP for costing them the election. The truth is that the SDP took as many Tory as Labour voters, as far as we can tell from polling. There was also the Falklands War, the economic recovery that had just started, all the stuff we talked about in Thatcherism, and the perception that Labour is weak and divided and incompetent and extreme.
I wonder where they got that idea from.
You just don't want to be seen as incompetent and extreme. That is really a poisonous cocktail. Now, Gerald Kaufman, an MP on the right, famously called the manifesto the longest suicide note in history, right? Isn't that like one of the political quotes that like everybody knows? Yeah. It is quite a Bennite document. It's aimed more at the party than the electorate, which is a bad idea. What's weird about it is that is a lot of the policies were individually popular and quite reasonable. There's like a lot of really good stuff in there. Like we should maybe start talking about a minimum wage and, investing more in early years childcare, and there's lots of good stuff. Unfortunately, the top line is leaving the EEC, abolition of the Lords, and unilateral disarmament, and that's a killer. Most Labour MPs didn't actually support it, and even during the campaign, some of them were like openly rejecting their own manifesto, which is not a great sign.
This is such a strange because it's sort of this weirdly celebratory British policy, because it implicit in the unilateral nuclear disarmament idea is the idea that Britain really, really matters. Because what follows? I mean, is it just an island has gotten rid of its nukes? It's, what the presumption is, and by our shining moral example, the Soviet Union and the US will decide that they will get rid of their nukes too. And it sounds idealistic. In fact, it has a sort of nostalgia for the days of empire, of British influence.
Well, and as does leaving Europe.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah,
there is a kind of weird, like, siege nationalism to the Labour left at this point.
Fuck, they would hate you saying that, but it's true. It's true.
Austin Mitchell MP wrote a fantastically good autopsy of the election, which I recommend in book club. Every page is quotable. A couple of things I think are really relevant to what we're talking about. It says, to be constantly talking about socialism and policies as socialist is to cut ourselves off. It is our language and our aspiration. It is not that of the mass of the people, and we should be talking to them and not to each other. Which really foretells, I think, the slight fading out of the word socialism from Labour rhetoric. But then he also criticises factions in general. Issues are never considered on their merits in the Labour Party. Which policy is right or relevant, what leader is best for the purposes of the party, whether a decision is fair or responsible. They are viewed exclusively in terms of power, who benefits and how. Does this strengthen the left or the right?
Right, amazing.
And that eternal truths from Austin Mitchell. John Golding, the Morgan McSweeney character I mentioned, he says, and this is pure like 2019, what we in the Labour Party have to ensure is that we never throw it away again. And to do that, we have to make certain that the party never again comes under control of the left. So Tony Benn loses his seat, which Golding counts as a Labour gain. Fantastic. I don't share his politics, but he's an entertainingly bitchy man.
Right.
But three crucial new MPs win theirs. Jeremy Corbyn, 33.
Wow.
Gordon Brown, 32.
Oof.
And Tony Blair, 30.
Just all the players in place so the whole godforsaken drama can play out all over again for the next 30 to 40 years.
No factional problems now. But it's time for Michael Foot to step down.
It is. And to be replaced by the new leader, Neil Kinnock. He undertakes a project, a long, brutal, hard project, to essentially make the party electable again. And this project will take place over 2 electoral cycles. That's how long it will take. In the first stage, between 1983 and 1987, he will essentially change the image of the party without really being in a strong enough position to be able to change the policies. Those policies that we've just mentioned, unilateral nuclear disarmament, opposition to Europe, nationalisation, they kind of stay in place until the next election. It's only the election after that, 1987 to 1992, that you start to get the changing of policies to appeal to the country. You're talking about a 10-year decontamination project.
Well, it's a journey for Kinnock as well.
Yeah.
Because, I mean, he was seen as a sort of heir to Nye Bevan. In fact, he was born in 1942 in Tredegar, the same place in Wales as Nye Bevan. And this is why, obviously, when he sort of moves to a soft left position, although still like initially well to the left of the median British voter, this is seen as such a betrayal. He was this fantastic inspirational orator, and you can still see, some of his speeches, the one that Biden famously ripped off. Why am I the first person in my family to go to university? It wasn't because they weren't worthy, it's because they didn't have the opportunities. They didn't have a platform to stand on. There's loads like that. And everybody around him said, you could see the more this process of reforming the Labour Party went on, the more his kind of lights dimmed and he came across as like more cautious, more technocratic, more mechanical. And this fire that everybody loved about him just couldn't survive this experience and things that were deeply uncomfortable. Like, I'm not sure if you got this impression, but it seemed incredibly painful, something like the miners' strike, from a mining heritage. Instinctively on their side, hated Thatcher, yet he didn't like Scargill. He didn't think they should have struck without a ballot. And, and so he's in this position where he feels completely helpless and conflicted and everybody sort of hates him. And this happens again and again.
Well, the thing is, the fact that he comes from the soft left, not from the centre or the right of the party, is instructive because these are his friends that he's fighting. These are actually mates of his that he is taking on for years. It's also instructive when you think about the way that you say that about the speech about why am I the first to go to university. There's a fantastic, you can hear it. He was on a radio show and he's asked by, I think, Nicky Campbell once, like, why does Labour have a problem with aspiration? And his angry response, where he's just like, well, how dare you? Like, aspiration is, you're able to send your child to university even though you worked in the pits, as his father did. That's what aspiration is. So he has this way of putting into language that it is socialistic, but it is not dogma and it is not abstract, It is something that people could imagine about their own lives and is actually quite colloquial. A set of values that are thoroughly left-wing, but not militant, not Trotskyist, none of the kind of archaic and extremely abstract kind of terminology and ideas that we've been dealing with throughout the series so far.
The aspiration question, I think, is key, though, because one of his famous speeches from 1983, before he becomes leader, is if Margaret Thatcher wins on Thursday, I warn you not to be ordinary, I warn you not to be young, I warn you not to fall ill, I warn you not to get old. It's an unbelievably powerful speech. But I think it sort of sums up that Labour's initial reaction to Thatcher, morally correctly, was defensive. It was about protecting the victims of Thatcherism. That was the focus, the unemployed and, workers, the poor and so on, rather than appealing to, perhaps the average voter. Maurice Saatchi, the advertising wizard who worked with Thatcher, he said the public perception was the Tories were cruel and efficient and Labour was incompetent and caring. And that was the problem, not to be less caring, but to be able to speak to other people, to not appear to be speaking solely for the vulnerable minority.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's something that he can aspire towards in his second period, in the second electoral period, throughout the late 80s. But initially, he's got too many internal battles to be able to go there. He gets hit by the miners' strike, as you just outlined. It's a period of real vicious industrial fighting with appalling images on the television of the police sort of, against striking picket lines. He's completely hamstrung by it. He can only speak about it once in Parliament. I mean, there's nothing he can do. He can't not support the miners, but he can't support the miners. And it elevates all of these ideas that are very damaging to Labour. Law and order, industrial action. It starts to, by the end of it, the miners lose very, very badly indeed. It starts to close down deep mining, which is where you get a core part of Labour's electoral support. So it's an absolutely debilitating series of experiences. However, internally, what it gives him is this idea of he can warn very effectively about the strategic dangers of leftism. He can say moderation is the way. You follow Scargill and this kind of militancy, it gets us nowhere. My way has some opportunity of success.
Because it's not just that Thatcher won the economic argument, it's that she, partly deliberately destroyed Labour's institutional bases, or in doing what she wanted to do, she destroyed them. So that's, heavy industry, the trade unions, council housing by selling that off, local government. She ends up abolishing Ken Livingstone's GLC. So it's kind of like chipping away at like the power centres and a lot of the kind of core support for Labour.
So militant tendency, as we mentioned earlier, he knows that he has to take them on at some point. By the early 1980s, they're securing parliamentary candidate status. So he's looking for a chance to strike. And he gets it in 1985 due to the actions of Liverpool City Council. Now, Liverpool City Council, pretty strongly influenced by militant, really on the verge of just a complete takeover by this Trotskyist group. And in particular, the council deputy leader, Derek Hatton. The original offence is quite bizarre. It's this sort of PR stunt where they kind of want to say to the government, you've got to give us more money. And in a way of demonstrating that, they show if you keep on paying us this amount of money, then we're going to have to make everyone redundant. This is being strangled by Tory sort of expenditure. And to demonstrate this, they send out redundancy notices to all 31,000 employees. Of course, that's just the point where they just go wrong of Labour's heart. You know what I mean? It's that idea of like security and employment. And Kinnock knows it. He instantly knows that that's what they've gone wrong. It's the 1985 Labour conference, and finally he can just go for the jugular. He does so in what is probably the single finest bit of oratory in post-war British history. One of the things he's outlining here isn't just an attack on militant tendency. It is actually a sort of love letter to reformist parliamentary socialism rather than revolutionary and militant socialism. He says, I'll tell you what happens with impossible promises. You start with far-fetched resolutions. They are then pickled into a rigid dogma, a code, and you go through the years sticking to that, outdated, misplaced, irrelevant to the real needs, and you end in the grotesque chaos of a Labour council. A Labour council? I'd stop it. I'm really trying to not do it like him quite fucking hard. Hiring taxis to scuttle around the city, handing out redundancy notices to its own workers. Crucial part is pickled into a rigid dogma, a code. And that's the thing, is like he recognises that parliamentary socialism changes, it evolves, it adapts to circumstances. It doesn't just retreat to this theoretical framework. When we were covering the Bolsheviks, right, at no point do they ever go back and go like, I wonder how we're going to get this past the public.
Sure, yeah.
It's always like, how do I justify this by version of Marxism, which becomes increasingly whatever. Instead here, he connects it to the human by virtue of connecting socialism with democracy, that big project that's always there at the heart of the parliamentary road. I mean, it just explodes in the room. So first of all, there's a round of applause. Then there's these heckles, these jeers. Hatton is in the crowd. He starts just shouting, liar. Liverpool Walton MP Eric Heffer is on the platform and with quite a lot of dignity, but also quite a lot of spite, just stands up and walks off in protest. And there is just chaos in the room for like a full minute. When you watch it now on YouTube, and if you have not seen this, I cannot stress to you how much you need to just go do that. You miss that minute of chaos, but there's chaos in the room for a minute. And then Kinnock says the most important line, I think, I'll tell you and you'll listen. I'm telling you, you can't play politics with people's jobs and with people's services. And you'll listen is the bit of like, just no, the leadership is going to have authority over this party, and we are not just going to have this sort of craze of revolutionary activity happening. His approval rating saw the militant threat is seen off by around 1987. And over the next few years, I mean, he starts just removing Bennites from every level of the party. So by the time you get to that 1987 election, he actually has authority. But that's how long it takes. It takes years for him to establish his authority over the party at all.
Well, let's see what the left is doing at this point, because you do have quite a lot of interesting stuff going on coming out of, like, for example, the GLC and London and these various campaign groups making a successful effort to get Black and Asian MPs elected for the first time in 1987. People like Diane Abbott, Paul Boateng, Bernie Grant.
Right.
And symbolically, Kinnock replaces the red flag with the red rose as Labour's logo in 1986. All of these symbolic things are hugely important. The left is really, it's very strong in the grassroots. It was London in the 80s and a lot of British cities in the 80s, incredibly left wing, and the legacy is sort of still with us in many positive ways. But at the top of the party, like you said, it's losing.
There's an election in 1987. Labour does terribly. The thing is that the economy's fully recovered at this point. Alliance is still covering the centre-left. It's a thankless task. There was very little expectation that Labour was going to do particularly well. Yeah. There's very little criticism of Kinnock for not doing better than he did. And he remains leader after the election takes place.
Yeah, that shows you, doesn't it, that nobody expected Labour to be able to climb back from 83 in one term.
No, exactly. And so this is really when he starts doing the heavy lifting on policy. On Europe, as we covered in the Thatcher episode, Jacques Delors comes to do a speech to the TUC, to the Trade Union Congress in 1988. Really crucial speech, because it's the point that the left he basically says, look, this is a social project. It's not just free markets. You know what I mean? This is about workers' rights, working time directives, things like that. It's a crucial moment because this is the point you start to see Thatcher tear off into sort of anti-Europe. And in fact, arguably the right starts to, before had been quite pro-Europe, and a series of things are about to happen. The Berlin Wall is going to fall down. It's going to lose that sense of consolidation against communism, look for other missions and find Europe. This Delors speech, selling it as quite a left-wing initiative, is part of that process. And the unions start to become, and in fact the left in general in Britain starts to become pro-European. So we finally end up in a situation with Europe like the one that we understand today, rather than the rather alien one that existed before that 1988 speech. That shifts the party's policy towards Europe. The party ditches its commitment to unilateral nuclear disarmament. It ditches its commitment to nationalisation and big tax increases. So really and for Kinnock, these are policies that he'd supported all of his life, and he really just had to get there in the trenches to finally extinguish these things that were really threatening Labour's electoral viability.
But he made that journey himself from a no voter in the 1975 referendum, and people remember from the 2016 referendum, one of the most powerful and resonant Remainers.
Yeah.
So he is part of that. It's not a cynical thing. It seems like it's a genuine thing, and he's trying to save the Labour Party. He says, I think, early on, if the Labour Party goes down the wrong path, it courts disaster, for no political institution has a divine right to exist. They really, John Cruddas in his book, A Century of Labour, calls this the death question. Like the number of times in Labour's history that people are just like, what if this party is just over?
Well, you've got to think, right? Go back to, when MacDonald got them in the first time, he gets them into power over the corpse of the Liberal Party. The origin story of Labour in government is seeing another progressive, the Liberal Party is quite complicated in terms of whether it's progressive or not, but ultimately the receptacle of where progressive votes were going, and taking bits of its corpse and applying it to its own body so that it could adopt that role. So deep in the DNA of the party is this muscle memory, this recognition of the fact that it can die, and the Conservatives do not have that, because their history goes back so far, so many centuries in a way, that you just don't have that kind of recognition.
Now, this is Ben's last stand. In 1988, he runs for leader. He gets 12% to Kinnock's 88%, which is a sort of crushing low. He takes it well. The NEC has abandoned socialist aspirations and any idea of transforming society, and he talks about Kinnockism as like Labour Thatcherism.
Right.
His name becomes mud. When Ken Livingstone and John McDonnell, they fell out over rates capping at the GLC. I won't go into it, but it was a real sort of like a financial crisis that they had, and they had different sort of solutions to this. McDonnell broke off his sort of working relationship and friendship and snapped, he's a Kinnock.
Oh, wow.
And you mentioned the veteran left-wing MP Eric Heffer earlier. He was dying, and Kinnock visits him in hospital. And Heffer says, it's you who should be dying, not me.
Jesus fucking Christ.
It's very, very brutal. And the fact that he is somebody from the left, originally a sort of Bevanite kind of figure, and then moves to the soft left, the fact that it's him doing it, rather than that being like a more acceptable way to do it, it makes the sort of hard left hate him more because it seems like he's a traitor.
Yeah, but my God. I mean, he must have been so lonely in those years, really. Because, that's what you're getting from, and of course from the right, the kind of vitriol directed towards him and the mockery, I mean, he would have really, those would not have been relaxing years.
No.
However, there is a real sense of hope during this period.
Yeah.
And I think this hope becomes one of the sort of the haunting aspects of the Labour personality. The economy is faltering, inflation is rising, Thatcher's introduced the poll tax, she is fucking up left, right and centre. She's lost her common touch, right? She doesn't really get when things are going to blow up in her face. Labour starts winning by-elections, soaring in the polls, 28-point lead. This goes on for years. And it starts to just kind of assume that it's going to win the next election. I think that's where that kind of Three Lions English football team melancholic sense to the Labour personality comes from. Because it's just almost like we always defeated in the end. It's like it's semi-finals or whatever, and you will go to pens. Like, that's your problem.
Yeah.
And that is what happens. I mean, the Tories replace Thatcher with John Major, nice fresh face on things. They get rid of the poll tax. By those two things alone, getting rid of Thatcher, getting rid of the poll tax, you got rid of your two big weaknesses. That kind of mercenary Tory sensibility, we know what we need to do. Labour has a pretty poor electoral campaign in 1992. They inexplicably hold a sort of celebratory rally in Sheffield 1 week before the election, which just looks like chutzpah at best, utterly disingenuous and quite baffling. The Conservatives end with a majority of 336 seats to Labour's 271 seats, and Kinnock then quit. It's just a handful of constituencies that it comes down to, a handful of votes, really. And yet, after this point, it's like almost no left-winger can win, is the assumption, right? That's what the assumption is under Blair. That's what the assumption is under Starmer. You can't be left at all. You've got to be centrist and make a bunch of centre-right noise. That's not what Kinnock's proposition was. Kinnock's proposition was not Trotskyism, none of this zany shit, but we are genuinely left-wing. We're not ashamed to say that we're on the left. And that kind of dies in 92. It's almost like not even this kind of left will do. You have to move yourself even further to the right. And that is what takes place under John Smith, who takes over the party next.
Another Scot.
And it's a very Scottish story, the story of the Labour Party, really. I mean, this idea of the SNP sort of argument, we've got to leave the Labour Party is just this creature of Westminster. It's pretty much a creature of Scottish men. That's what it is. Son of a head teacher, goes into law, first stands as a candidate at the age of 23. He's always been on the right of the party. Very effective performer in the Commons. His manner is much more the part of the modernising centrist than Kinnock's manner is. That thing you say, if it always looked like Kinnock was fitting into a strange set of clothes for him. Yeah. That's not what you thought with John Smith. He looked like someone that might or might not give you a loan in the local branch of your bank.
His personality and his political project were perfectly aligned.
Yes, exactly. His vibes were on point. Yeah. Very slow, very cautious, but a modernizer through and through. That's the project that he's following. In December 1992, he announces the Commission on Social Justice under the auspices of the IPPR think tank, the Institute for Public Policy Research. That's really important. People don't talk about it. One of the things that we see now with Starmer, when the administration came online, is the sort of thing of they hadn't done a lot of prep on policy and in lots of areas really didn't know what they wanted to do. One of the reasons that wasn't the case with Blair when he came in is because years earlier in 92 under John Smith, they started the policy machine. Because already it was clear, fine, we may have just got this almighty twatting when we least expected it, but we really are odds on to win the next election. You know what I mean? So we'll do the fucking policy work. They had lots of ideas, heavily tested, heavily forensically scrutinized by the IPPR, ready to go at the point that they entered Downing Street.
I hadn't realised how many of New Labour's best ideas were really launched by John Smith.
Yeah.
in terms of like a Human Rights Act, I think Freedom of Information Act, minimum wage, some of the reforms to the party, like abolishing the union bloc vote. And funnily enough, some of them were from the 1983 manifesto.
Right.
You know, that what they hadn't,
minimum wage.
What they hadn't done was just go, well, this manifesto failed, therefore it's trash. Like, they kind of weeded through it and thought, okay, well, if we're not talking about, if you remove the kind of really toxic stuff, there's some great ideas here. And John Smith, in his sort of quiet managerial way, sort of sets up all this stuff that Blair can then inherit.
He dies of a massive heart attack, utterly unexpected, in May 1994.
Like Gateskill.
Yeah, but you see, funny enough, I think of him almost like the sort of Trotsky of the Labour story in this way, because from this point on, he becomes the receptacle of all the dreams that people slightly to the left of Blair, wish that the new Labour administration had, because he was to the right of Kinnock, but he was to the left of Blair.
Yeah.
And so there's this sort of, it's not even a myth that takes hold, but there's this sort of view he would have won the election. I mean, I think he would have, probably with a smaller majority, but I think he would have. And then we would have seen at least more of a centre-lefty kind of view.
Are you the first person to compare John Smith to Trotsky?
I might be.
I didn't have space to mention it earlier, but I thought it would delight you that one of the first efforts pre-Kinnock to crack down on militant was called Operation Ice Pick.
Oh, wow. That's some dark fucking...
That's proper like McSweeney brain.
Yeah, it is. Yeah. That's absolutely brutal.
I think that might be our last mention of Trotsky in this episode.
You never know. The battle to take over the Labour Party after his death is going to go down to one of two men, Tony Blair or Gordon Brown. I'll give you a quick bio of both of them. Gordon Brown, Scottish, obviously, because apparently that's just mandatory, son of a minister, which has a huge impact on him and I think kind of partially defines his whole attitude towards politics. Elected to Parliament, as you said, in 1983, frontbencher by 1985, shadow cabinet 2 years after that, very big brain, very big ego, uncharismatic, extremely hardworking, dour, angry, resentful, profoundly conscientious, self-absorbed, prone to explosive temper tantrums, subject to flashes of proper genius, I think, motivated by a real sense of social justice, a very complicated man whose many qualities and flaws would be cruelly exposed by the time he did get the top job many years from this point. Tony Blair, his dad wanted to be a Tory MP, which is not something I think you could have said for almost anyone else in this story.
Well, funnily enough, I actually noted this because I was struck by that. They said, son of a Tory. So Ken Livingstone.
No.
Stafford Cripps. Ken Loach.
I retract.
Yes, it's not unusual to be a left-wing son of a Tory. Not that Tony Blair was necessarily left-wing, but I'm just saying we shouldn't hold that against him.
He was a little bit left-wing at sort of at the beginning, soft left, but drifts to the right, throughout his time in power.
Do you believe anything he said?
About his journey.
At that point, in 1982, when he was trying to get a candidacy, right?
Yeah.
He writes to Michael Foot saying, I came to socialism through Marxism.
Right. That is very hard to believe.
He plainly didn't. And then when he's elected, I think, or just when he's trying to get elected, he goes, I'm a Labour man, not a Bennite or any other ite. Like, I just couldn't locate where he was politically. And when he said he wanted to be an MP, one of his friends said, really, which party?
Well, to be fair, okay. Well, hold on. To be fair, in uni, he's in a band. He just doesn't really care about politics. It's quite clear that this is a late stage. He becomes a barrister, and clearly at some point, so enough people sort of say, you know what, you'd probably be quite a good politician. Which, incidentally, he really fucking was.
He was a great politician on that level.
And so in he goes. He enters Parliament as well in 1983. He's on the front bench within 7 months. It's just a ridiculously fast turnaround. Shadow Home Secretary in 1992. They know that someone has to run on a modernisation ticket. Blair, weirdly, gets his campaign running faster because he's less emotionally affected by Smith's death. Gordon Brown, very, very close to Smith, was much more affected, much slower off the ground. Blair is also southern. He's middle class, I don't think these things were irrelevant at the time. There's a real sense of just like, we must win. You know what I mean? Like, we cannot lose again.
I mean, that's why I'm sympathetic, because he's absolutely traumatized by these defeats. And he's like, we have to win and we have to learn lessons, declaw the media, win people's trust on economy, on patriotism, on defense, on all of those sort of Labour weak spots. He's absolutely convinced by that. And also he's well aware that he's not as wedded to the party. So there's an argument that if it wasn't for Cherie, his wife, he might have joined the SDP rather than Labour.
Oh, right? Really? She's the one that pushed it?
It's sort of credited between like Cherie and Derry Irvine, the left-wing barrister that he worked for. He sort of could have gone, not Tory, but SDP or Labour. And there's an amazing quote that he tells an advisor later on, I think when he's in office. What gives me real edge is that I'm not as Labour as you lot.
Right, yeah.
So he's sort of passionately invested in Labour winning, and yet at the same time, he's just like semi-detached from Labour. And at certain points he'll claim, obviously, as you must do if you're the Labour leader, that the party is in your bones. But I think he kind of admitted that his strength was he didn't seem like a Labour guy in the way that Kinnock absolutely did.
Yes, and Brown did.
And Brown did.
Yeah. They have a meeting in a restaurant called Granita. It's 127 Upper Street, Islington. So it's right around the corner from where we're recording this, and I think that you and I have walked by it, I presume, where it used to be.
Where it used to be,
times.
yeah, it closed down. Yeah.
It closed in 2003 and was replaced by a Tex-Mex called Desperados. So I'm really glad that they had their meeting at the right time, because otherwise it just wouldn't have that same resonance.
Oh, that's such a good detail.
So Brown withdraws at this point, doesn't want to split the moderniser vote, but he gets commitments from Blair that he'll be made Chancellor and that he'll mostly be in control of domestic policy, and that at some point Blair will step back and he'll become Prime Minister, which is one of those, it takes a lot of trust. He will never forget, he will never forgive. The rest of British politics for the next 15 years is defined by basically that dinner they had in that restaurant on Upper Street.
The TBGBs, as it was called at the time. The TBGBs,
which I can't, if you didn't live through that, I can't tell you how lucky you are. Well, you're kind of unlucky because everything that's happened afterwards has been, financial crisis and despair.
Yeah.
However, it just had no political or ideological content to it at all. It was just two blokes wading through paranoia and grievance in a psychodrama that we all had to live through. He's a very lucky man, Tony Blair, as a leader. Kinnock had decontaminated the party. Smith had set up this detailed policy program. The Conservatives were doing all the really difficult economic things that had to be done that he would much rather have not had to do himself, and left him with a very nice set of economic conditions of the sort that Keir Starmer would fucking die for.
Is he the only Labour Prime Minister not to inherit a crisis?
I think you're spot. I think you said that last time, right? And I think that's absolutely spot on, and a crucial distinction as to why he works. And the Tories are in a state of an ideological muddlement by the end of the Cold War. There's this splintering, and the backbone of their beliefs is gone. However, he knows that he needs to reassure the public. He knows that same thing that MacDonald would always talk about, is fear of the unknown, fear of Labour getting into power. He has to reassure voters. So he goes back to our old friend, Clause 4.
Oh, yeah.
The old Clause 4, you will remember, at the heart of the Labour Party sort of Bible is common. It states that it would support common ownership of the means of production. That is this kind of this steel beam at the heart of what socialism is. And once you give up on it, you start dealing with much more disparate ideas like, do you believe in equality? Do you believe that maybe competition isn't the ideal way of organising human society? Do you believe that we can interfere in private property? And a sort of much broader set of ideas that are often shared by liberals as well as they are by anyone else. So now he takes aim at that phrase, that core phrase. He changes it and he succeeds. He changes it to Labour is still called, quote, a democratic socialist party, but it is aimed at, quote, a community in which power, wealth and opportunity are in the hands of the many, not the few, which is a good indication of the kind of mishy-mashy Labour nothing language that permeated this era.
It's quite incredible that that very powerful slogan that we associate with Corbyn was literally taken from, intentionally or not, the thing that Blair did that seemed like a sort of hammer blow at the left.
Yeah, that's actually incredible, right? So he gets it approved by the NEC, he gets it approved at party conference. People are just desperate to win at this point. And he then does something quite interesting. we've said this throughout this season, that once you give up on that phrase, social ownership of the means of production, that really kind of quite, radical socialist proposal, it's hard to see where this begins and liberalism is and, all that stuff.
Yeah.
Well, weirdly, he's quite explicit about it.
Yeah.
Like his advisor, Philip Gold, puts it like this. He's going all the way back to MacDonald, really, and getting into power by killing the Liberal Party. In establishing itself as a socialist party immutably linked to trade unionism, Labour broke with liberalism and cut itself off from the other great radical movement in British politics. The separation of Labourism and liberalism stopped dead the possibility of building one united progressive party similar to the broader coalitions in the United States and Scandinavia.
Yeah.
And Blair kind of sets to work just kind of essentially trying to meld liberalism and socialism, those traditions in their party political forums together. He starts working very closely with the Liberal Democrat leader, Paddy Ashdown. He starts working very closely with Jenkins himself as this sort of kind of spiritual leader of his project, really.
Well, Jenkins loves him initially. He's the most exciting leader since Hugh Gaitskell. And Tony Benn, not as a compliment, calls Jenkins the grandfather of New Labour.
Right. Well, which it's kind of works, sort of. I mean, they're far less liberal in the end than...
Well, that's what's interesting. But at this point, he's saying, there's a speech that I'm sure you know as well, because my heroes aren't just Ernie Bevan, Nye Bevan and Attlee, they also Keynes, Beveridge, Lloyd George. And he's trying to heal what he sees. It's a really interesting argument. I think it partly comes from David Marquand, who was a SDP guy and wrote a very good history of Labour, this idea that this rift was the tragedy of progressives in the 20th century, and that's what enabled the Tories to dominate.
They make a bunch of reassurances to voters, which they think they need to do in order to get power. No tax rises, they'll stick to Tory spending plans, no European single currency without a referendum. There's quite a profound change, though, I think, in that the language of Labour, they do things like the minimum wage, but the language of Labour moves quite decisively from producers to consumers. The history of socialism of every type that we've looked at has always focused on the worker, on the producer. What are your conditions at work? How much are you paid? How are you reimbursed? Now there's a much greater language around the consumer. Now, of course, everyone in their lives is kind of a producer and a consumer, but it's noticeable that the language has flipped. That is a real triumph, I think, for the right and a real movement away from socialism as we had it before.
Their relationship to the word socialism, to the idea of socialism, is so interesting. So it's noticed that in his 1995 conference speech, he used the word new 59 times, the word socialism once. And yet
once is a lot for him.
I looked up a book from 1996 called The Blair Revolution by Peter Mandelson and Roger Liddell. And you would think this is a book in 1996, written by Peter Mandelson, right? No time for socialism. No, actually it claims New Labour has a moral outlook that Keir Hardie and Clement Attlee would fully have shared.
Interesting.
And then there's a subsection called, Is This Socialism? And then just goes, yes. It's not a one-word section, but essentially goes, yes, it is. And I thought that is really interesting, that at the same time as it's saying all this stuff about a kind of alliance with sort of liberalism and trying to reach out to kind of disillusioned Tory voters, they don't want to explicitly go, oh, we're not socialist anymore.
But you see, I have to say, and this is going to sound more left-wing than I usually do, I think it's quite hard to find the socialism in the New Labour programme. Like, if we say, let's take those three ideas, okay, outside of socialisation of the means of production. Let's take just the belief in equality, okay? That's the one that they do keep to. However, they change things quite fundamentally. It's not really equality of outcome. It's equality of opportunity. The idea, the policy agenda of New Labour is essentially, we will equip you to function in the market. You know what I mean? We'll do it through education, through skills, through training. We'll take care of you if you hit the very bottom as well. Yeah. But ultimately, it's not equality of outcome. It's really that Peter Mandelson quote, we're intensely relaxed about people getting filthy rich as long as they pay their taxes. Now, our starting assumption, we said in the first episode, for most socialists, there's this sort of core emotional spring from which their feelings come of like, what is it to see the Rolls Royce go by a homeless man? Cool. Well, the Labour sentiment would ultimately be, well, that actually isn't really a problem. Do you know what I mean? Like, our job is to make sure you have equality of opportunity, but that the outcomes don't matter to us that much. So it's still there with equality, but not completely committed to it. How about their view on private property? Are they still critical of it? Not really at all. Nationalisation becomes unthinkable.
Yeah.
Taxation, and especially the idea you would increase taxes, is never defended, would be considered a complete political taboo, which incidentally lasts until this day. When we talk about the idea of being critical of competition, is there any of that in New Labour? None, really. In fact, if anything, they fetishise competition, and their answer to pretty much every problem is to increase competition within it, including public services. So it is true that at this point, we're going to come on to their accomplishments in a moment, but at this point, it is quite hard to find the meaningful strands of socialism from our first episodes that these guys have actually maintained.
Well, in the Centrism book, it was quite enjoyable tracking Blair's efforts to kind of put some meat on the bones of like the third way idea. There's a fabulous bit where a guy from the New Yorker asks Alistair Campbell on the campaign trail, like, what is the third way? And Campbell goes, it's neither old left nor new right. It means you keep what works and change what doesn't. I'm like, oh, okay.
Not his best, yeah.
No, unlike all the political ideas where you just want to keep definitely what does not work. And there's a wonderful quote from Roy.
To be fair, we have seen a lot of that in this season.
Actually. Oh, yeah, no, fair play. But Roy Hattersley, who is really interesting, quite an interesting figure on the Labour right, an intellectual, which I don't really remember. He wrote a really interesting book under Kinnock called Choose Freedom, which is a mixture of Crossland and John Rawls. It's very, very sort of liberal. And he really thinks you need ideas. So for too long, the mainstream of the Labour Party believed that it was possible to combat bad ideas by opposing ideas in general.
That's nice. That's very good.
And then he says about Blair, who is still in office, he's still chairing these meetings about the third way with people from around Europe and America and all that lot. And Hattersley says, since the Prime Minister believes in the third way, it is important for him to find out what it is. and that, he's not wrong. Like, you should know what the third way is before you take office. And not still constantly be trying to work out and putting out pamphlets and having conferences, trying to sort of explain what your project is.
Yeah, I don't think they ever work out. It just sounds good. They never really, it never has any kind of meaningful sort of content to it. There is one bit of, not even socialism really, but really Marxism that they really do have, which is the sense of like historical inevitability. It's completely reversed.
Yes.
For the Marxists, it was obviously towards communism. Here, it's towards globalized free markets.
It's more like end of history kind of stuff, right?
Yeah. But the language of inevitability it's kind of the only language Blair speaks. Like, listen to him. This is him at the Confederation of British Industries, CBI. We all know this is a world of dramatic change in technology, in trade, in media and communications. The choice: to let change overwhelm us, to resist it, or equip ourselves to survive and prosper in it. The first leads to a fragmented society. The second is pointless and futile, trying to keep the clock from turning. Trotsky could have said that. And the only... I've done it again.
Yeah.
And the only way is surely to analyse the challenge of change and to meet it. This is literally the same chat that the Marxists would have about, you can slow it down maybe, but it's inevitable. It only goes in
things
one
like
direction.
that about globalization. He says things like that now about AI.
Yes, exactly.
He is a great believer in Hegelian inevitability.
Yeah. When we interviewed him many years ago, we should have really raised that.
Yeah.
Tell me, how do you feel about Hegel? Nevertheless, despite all of the criticism that is aimed at the Labour government that eventually takes over in 1997 after winning an unprecedented 418 seats, it accomplishes huge amounts of things, not the least of which are the minimum wage, tax credits, Sure Start, Human Rights Act, the Equality Act, reduced NHS waiting times, general, just serious gains in health spending and performance across the board, reduced class sizes, high literacy and numeracy, huge advances in secondary and higher education, spending per pupil doubled, PFI, the private finance initiatives, which received a lot of criticism, but actually did manage to renew public service infrastructure, improved rail transport times, almost the complete eradication of homelessness, devolution in Scotland and Wales, the return of the London mayor, genuine steps, really genuine and substantial steps towards the eradication of child poverty, a very significant reduction in pensioner poverty, unemployment, inflation and interest rates all staying low, and liberalised laws on homosexuality, including equalising the age of consent. It is not a bad scorecard for this party. They never make a big deal out of it. I mean, they trump their own successes, but they try to present themselves as this very conservative, small c, no raising taxes. But actually, the redistribution of wealth that took under Labour was really quite significant.
I can't remember where I got this idea of which of the books, I'm afraid, but I like this sort of framing that because they were so cautious, they'd done that thing, which is a mistake Labour would never make again, which was committing not to raise taxes and to stick to Tory spending plans, was that almost in order to have things to do, because they couldn't do much on the economy apart from just be very sensible. Yeah. And so they do all this constitutional stuff that John Smith had set rolling, like devolution, and that he was willing to he wouldn't take risks on what he thought were Labour's weak points, but he would on Northern Ireland. So it's like, okay, if he failed in Northern Ireland, nobody would hold it against him. Most people don't think about Northern Ireland. I mean, it's obviously a big problem for people who live in Northern Ireland. But to him, that wasn't a big political risk. That turns out to be one of his great triumphs, the Good Friday Agreement. So there's this weird thing where loads and loads of good things are introduced in the first term because he's so worried about doing anything with the money. Yeah. And then the second term is when it gets more into there's sort of more spending, on the NHS, and there's more of a sort of an economic vision. But that thing of coming into office, sort of scared of your own shadow, that you've kind of, in order to diffuse all the bombs that could go off, you're just like, you've got no room to maneuver.
Well, it comes down to the economic situation again, right? Because like McDonald, he's got that same project, let's not scare the horses. And the difference is he has this really fortunate economic landscape. Yep. So McDonald's don't scare the horses and you putting a fucking rope around your neck and suffocating yourself. Here, after 2 years of being in power, people are literally, there are public pushing, saying, can you please spend some more money on the NHS?
Yeah.
You've got it. Don't pay down any, just put the fucking money. And that's exactly what Gordon Brown ends up doing. And that's the point where, there's this increase in spending. And also a far smarter way of assessing progress in public services as well. Labour wins in 2001 very, very easily indeed, 413 seats to the Tories' 166. It wins in 2005, really quite easily indeed, 356 seats to the Tories on 198. However, in 2006, Blair announces that he'll stand down, and finally, that old deal in the Islington restaurant comes to fruition, and Brown becomes leader without a contest in July 2007.
There's a lot of structural problems. So you say they won easily in 2005. Yes, but it's sort of a fluke landslide. The vote is down to like 36%. Turnout is historically low, but I think perhaps like the lowest ever. They're losing Scotland. You see in Scotland, they're losing student areas. Membership, interestingly, has halved.
Yeah.
The local base is disintegrating. So it's sort of, they did win easily, but against a very, very weak Tory party. And I think it's another one of those things where, yes, you're back, you've won, winning is great. Under the surface, there are all these problems, some of which are still with the Labour Party, losing working class voters, going down, still winning, but going down in seats that they used to take for granted.
Also, you've got to remember, this is Iraq. We're not talking about this foreign policy aspect because it's not really pertinent to socialism as we're talking about it. But this is the period of the Iraq War. I mean, that was pretty much the only thing anyone was talking about in this period. The stuff around everything else is irrelevant. Brown takes over. He makes a pivotal decision in 2007. He sort of allows these rumours of an election to start building. Very tempting because there's a bit of a bounce for Labour when Brown takes over. They're a bit sick of all the sort of, stylish Blair stuff, and he looks authentic. It doesn't last long, this bounce. And actually, the point that it ends is really when he decides that he's not going to have an election. And he sort of takes off the idea. He'd allowed the idea to percolate enough that it was a big call not to have it.
Like James Callaghan in 78, but sort of a lot more public?
Yeah, it was incredibly embarrassing and made him look indecisive. He actually never recovered from it. But also, I think arguably, given what followed, the country never really recovered from it either. Because the year afterwards, we get the financial crash. And suddenly, at that point, whether he should have had an election in 2007, whether he could have won it is another question. Certainly, he was never going to get any better conditions than the ones he had in 2007, because it was the last time he could go to the country as the party of abundance, as the party of economic victory. Then afterwards, it's always going to be quite monstrous. And the financial crash is interesting. It shows us all that was best and all that was worst about Gordon Brown. And all that was best and worst about Gordon Brown is fundamentally about his commitment to socialism. What's worst about him is that he was chancellor in the period building up to this. He had overseen a period where there was no critical assessment of what competition entailed in financial markets. There was no proper regulation of the products that, because of the financial crash, would end up bottoming out the British economy and, of course, economies, around the world. That is it's on a lot of people, but it's also on him. And during that period, he would constantly criticize those, who wanted more regulation, who had a much more critical view of the financial services, of banking, of investment banking, of these kinds of assets, and sort of talk about it as this kind of like outdated socialist nonsense. In fact, it turns out it wasn't.
But I wonder whether that seemed like an easy solution to just get growth from the city. From deregulating. There's a bit where he's complaining to his advisors, Ed Miliband and Ed Balls in the Treasury. About Blair, you'll never guess what he wants from me. He wants me to increase public spending and cut taxes without explaining how.
I mean, to be honest, that is what every chancellor has said about every prime minister for hundreds of years.
Yeah. I mean, that is basic, and that's what the British voters, as Roy Jenkins observed, always want.
Exactly.
They want low taxes and high public spending. But you can sort of see why it's very tempting to be just like, oh, okay, so if we just kind of unwind this regulation,
100%, then
it's sort of money for nothing, and then we get to spend on the services. But that's where your abundance comes from. It's a sort of devil's bargain with the market.
And I sat with, you sit with bankers at this period, and they were very compelling and convincing about how they'd ironed out risk. You know what I mean? Like, and you don't really know this stuff. You don't really know what these products are, these securities, so you believe them. However, he's the chancellor and it's different. What's most impressive about him then is how quickly he goes back to some of those socialist ideas once the crisis happens. There is, I say socialist. I mean, lots of it is just Keynesian, really. But, there is a Keynesian fund that an international fund that countries are encouraged to dip into. Britain doesn't do it, but many countries do. It really helps hold the system in place. He's a very early Western leader to nationalize banks, take control over them. I mean, suddenly when the moment comes, he knows what to do, and all of the old sort of ideas are dead. And then really importantly, in a way that we forget now, when the Conservatives start pushing for austerity, essentially for that kind of national government 1931 response, okay, fine, so let's just draw back all the spending, let's pay back deficit, exactly the wrong moment to do it. You need to encourage your economy, stimulate it while it's lacking demand. You need to be borrowing to invest at the moment that it's very, very cheap to do so. Austerity ruins this country to the period until now. So many of the tribulations that we have are as a result of that period. He is constantly in a rearguard battle trying to prevent that outcome, fighting against austerity. He has such a weird reputation, Gordon Brown. He's not remembered for the thing he got utterly wrong, failure to regulate the financial services. He's not remembered for the thing he got utterly right, which is the sort of Keynesian and socialistic response after the financial crash. And I honestly think that if he hadn't bottled that election, we would have had him in charge for the next 5 years. Austerity wouldn't have happened. You look at a very, very different Britain that would have taken place if he'd come to a different judgment when he thought that he won't go to the country.
Well, interestingly, he's much more popular with Labour members now than Blair is.
Yeah. I mean, 2010, it's not as disastrous as a result as people would have thought. I mean, Labour gets 258 seats, the Tories get 305, Lib Dems get 57. It's a hung parliament. The numbers don't really work for Labour and the Lib Dems. You'd have to put together other parties as well. It's going to be the Conservatives and the Lib Dems.
It's the return of what happens in 2005 is you get the return of three-party politics. And it's so interesting when you're talking about vote share. It's very hard to compare like with like. We'll get on to 2017. 2017, obviously, Labour's vote share is, I think, up to 40%. Amazing. Yeah. It's a two-party election.
Yeah.
It is Tories, Labour, that's that. It's almost like it's the 1950s again. Yeah. And what you see in like 2005 and then 2010 is like three-party. Now it's like, five-party politics.
Yeah, at least.
And it just makes such a huge, and in first past the post, as we know, that's sort of chaos.
Okay, so very briefly, let's go from where we are then in 2010 to where we are now. Ed Miliband runs against David Miliband for the leadership of the Labour Party once Gordon Brown goes. These are both the children of Ralph Miliband, the Labour Party historian, because this party is an absolute fucking soap opera drama.
The anti-Labour Marxist. I mean, he just didn't like the Labour Party because it wasn't socialist enough.
No. Ed Miliband wins it very, very, very narrowly over his brother, primarily because of the assistance of the unions. It really puts his leadership in an unenviably weak position from the very beginning. He is a witty, intelligent and principled man who is really unable to demonstrate any of those qualities for the time that he's Labour leader.
Yeah.
He loses in 2015 to David Cameron. Labour gets 232 seats to the Tories 330. The Lib Dems completely collapse to 8 as a result of the coalition. And the SNP win 56. And then Jeremy Corbyn becomes leader. This is that cycle that we've now seen several times over the course of this story, and the hard left coming back into the fold in the wake of an election defeat.
Now, can I talk about the left, the revenge of the left?
Yes.
Because this is the first time they're ever actually in charge, right? Under Blair was quite canny about it. He tolerated a lot of left-wing MPs like Corbyn because they were popular locally, and he was actually very personally fond of Tony Benn. While discouraging new MPs from joining the Socialist campaign group, going, this is not going to help your career, mate. Mandelson said that they built a sealed tomb for the left. Now, sometimes somebody broke out of the sealed tomb, like Ken Livingstone, who actually originally, I had no idea, wanted to serve in Blair's cabinet.
Oh, wow, I didn't know.
Really, really wanted to be part of things. Obvious Labour candidate for London Mayor. People might remember that he wasn't selected, and then he ran as an independent and won and served 2 terms. So there was a bit of a breakout there. You had Livingstone's former part of the GLC, John McDonnell, who's, setting up his new organisations. Again, that classic left dilemma. Do you abandon Labour or do you transform it? Both prospects seem quite sort of bleak. He couldn't even get enough nominations to challenge Brown for the leadership in 2007. There's just a series of kind of failures. They were in a very, very weak spot. And then what you get, due to rule changes to weaken the union vote and give it all to the members, suddenly this opening for a guy who never wanted to be leader.
Yeah.
I don't think we need to introduce Jeremy Corbyn except to say, quite old by this point, born in 1950, and a proper old Bennite. Voted against Blair's first government 64 times, more than any other Labour MP. And he was just the perennial backbench rebel, basically had the same ideas that he had in 1970?
Yeah, I think that's right.
I would say Polly Toynbee, right? Polly Toynbee, I don't think of her as like a vicious writer. But when he was running, said, a 1983 man, a relic of the election that brought him to Parliament when Labour was destroyed by its out of NATO, anti-EU, renationalise everything suicide note. Like somebody who's fucking scarred by 1983, Polly Toynbee. None of that. And yet he taps into that old Bennite energy. It's the young, it's the grassroots, it's all these different kind of, there's identity politics, there's sort of utopian socialism. It's almost like he manages to appeal to every strand of the left that has felt shut out. Yeah. And they go, this is it. This is finally our chance to run things.
So in 2017, he comes probably as close as the hard left, as the Labour hard left has ever come to power. There is a result which leaves it with Labour with 262 votes, as you said, on 40% of the vote. Tories on 317, losing their majority. It's obviously felt preposterous at the time, the way that lots of Labour sort of figures acted as if they'd just won the election, when it's like, well, you've still lost. But nevertheless, that was as close, I think, as the hard left's ever come to taking power.
As they will tell you, and I said, it's largely because of the collapse of the Lib Dems, and it's a two-party thing. 40% is pretty fucking impressive. It's their biggest swing since 1945. They've got the highest membership since 1979. The 2017 manifesto is really interesting and it's well worth reading, as is the 1983 and the 97. It's largely written by Andrew Fisher. It's called "For the Many, Not the Few," the new Labour slogan. And it avoids a lot of the mistakes. It's sort of optimistic. It's sort of morally indignant, but it's got loads of popular policies, the sort of things that Miliband was trying to do, but then kind of like buckled.
Yeah.
What he called one nation Labour. It does not mention the word socialism once, which is fascinating.
Yeah, it is.
And this is something that Corbynites will go, what a wonderful kind of manifesto it is. If you look at it just in the same way that sort of 1997 is a bit more Some of the New Labour policies are more radical than you'd think. And the 1983 manifesto is less wild than you'd think. 2017 manifesto is really quite kind of, it's very canny. It's very sensible. Corbyn himself called it depressingly moderate. So it really was quite an impressive feat that they pulled off, but a balancing act. And the left was always torn between, do you remember this? Always going, some people would go, oh, it's a radical, we're going to change everything. And other people go, it's just common sense social democracy. What's to be worried about?
Yes, I think that's right. That was a real, despite all of the kind of vibe of radicalism, there was no attempt, for instance, to reintroduce Clause 4.
Yeah.
In terms of the explicit socialist sort of, doctrines, that didn't come back into play. And in fact, most of the messaging, usually directed quite aggressively towards people like me, was all we want is Scandinavia. You know what I mean? That's what we're talking about here, just sort of like a bit further to the left, social democracy, and that's what the public want too. So there was a bit of a discrepancy between the emotional state and the kinds of policies that were being proposed. Sometimes a bit more sort of wacky stuff slipped out there. But you're right, especially in that 2017 election, things were quite restrained. And even in the 2019 manifesto, where Labour dropped 60 seats to 202 seats, the Tories gained 48 seats to 365. This is when Boris Johnson takes over and Corbyn leaves. The individual policies themselves were not that radical. What there was a very high density of policies in the manifesto.
Too long again.
For a party that really hadn't demonstrated or proved to voters that it would have the competency to deliver them.
It's weird how similar the two manifestos were, though, because it's considered because of the results. The 2017 one must have been great, and the 2019 one must have been a disaster.
Yeah.
And so much was just about impressions. And I think the problem with Corbyn is that he almost embodied everything the Labour left and the grassroots love, right? But he embodied everything that people who don't like Labour hate. So ex-Labour voters in one group here criticised Corbyn's weakness, indecision, lack of patriotism, apparent terrorist sympathies, failure to deal with anti-Semitism, outdated and excessively left-wing worldview, and obvious unsuitability to lead the country. Now, whether that you consider all of those criticisms fair or not, that is sort of a list of the nightmare scenario for a Labour leader. That is all of the weak spots that everybody since McDonald has been worrying about. Exactly. You don't want to seem unpatriotic. You don't want to seem incompetent with money. Yeah. You don't want to seem like, weak on defence. You don't want to seem kooky and cranky. And so even though there's a lot of very clever people in there, like Andrew Fisher, producing actually really, really good policies, and I would love to have seen the 2017 manifesto enacted, the guy in the front, who is both a kind of saint figure, like, a cult-like, celebrity, and at the same time represents a lot of the reasons why Labour lose. And I think that's probably why people still... And obviously there are terrible, bitter, nasty arguments about this, but I think there's a lot of really sensible ones about what happened in 2017, what happened in 2019, what were the strengths of Corbynism, what were the weaknesses. Because now, obviously, it's 1983 again, but sort of worse. It's like, well, this is what happens. Like John Golding said, the only way to win is that you never, ever, ever let the left be in charge again.
Yeah. Well, look, I mean, but the honest truth is that after that period, during a period that really ended up defining the material reality of British life because of Brexit, because of what was happening on the right, the Labour Party had become just offline for electoral purposes. It was having a conversation with itself. It was a vicious, snarling, bloodletting conversation. It was not a fun place to be or to be anywhere near. And of course, all of this was through the prism of Brexit, which is all anyone was talking about at the time, and makes everything really quite hard to judge. So for instance, of course we can talk about whether the public were or weren't on board with ideas in the manifesto during these periods, but the vast majority of the electoral dynamics were, can you unite a pro or anti-Brexit view?
Yes.
And how it had just mangled party politics together.
We don't know how it would have fared, how that would have fared without Brexit.
I mean, the fascinating thing would be to see what a Corbyn leadership would have looked like without Brexit taking place. And I think, by the way, I'm sure that he would love that and think things would have gone much better. I think actually that could be very detrimental to him, because the more that there was a real sense of status quo outside of him, the less zany an option that would have necessarily looked. He fitted into the Brexit sort of era because nothing made sense at the time. So it wasn't even that crazy to make him Prime Minister. In 2024, after an astonishingly short period in opposition, given how high the electoral mountain was for him to climb, the new Labour leader, Keir Starmer, secured a historic result of 411 seats, admittedly on 33.7% of the vote, the Tories on 121, and the Lib Dems, now recovered from their previous malaise, on 72 seats. And that brings us to where we are today. Of course, Starmer, if you've been paying attention to this story, that could be the Lansbury to Attlee. It could be the Foot to Kinnock. It is just the same process happening again and again and again. And this is the period that we're in right now. I have no doubt in my mind that if we were to do an update to this podcast in 30 years' time, we will have seen another 2 or 3 of these cycles take place.
Well, I think what's happened with Starmer, I think John Cruddas says that he very successfully ran as the sort of Labour everyman because he had parts in his history. He used to write for the magazine Socialist Alternatives. It was quite Benite. We did this in the Starmer episode, human rights lawyer, etc., seemed like a figure of the soft left. Something sort of happened on things that looked like they were in that part of the party. So if you look at Blue Labour, which I think we should definitely do like a bonus episode on at some point.
That would be fun, actually. Yeah.
That starts off under Ed Miliband. Ed Miliband is the person who embraces that, much more communitarian ideas, stakeholding and what we call predistribution. It seemed pretty productive then, before it went kind of mad and a lot of people broke off and just went, I don't want to have anything to do with this. Labour Together, similarly, after 2015, is founded by soft left MPs like John Cruddas and Lisa Nandy. Also with some Blairites and Blue Labour people. But then after Morgan McSweeney is made director, then that becomes more brutal. And so the factions are really quite confusing because either Blue Labour or Labour Together, both of which I think are kind of demonised by people who are anchored with Starmer now, they didn't start like that, and Starmer didn't start like that. And there's a reason why a lot of people are really quite confused and disappointed. And this is your full-time job, trying to explain sort of Starmer. But there is a bit of that feeling of like, well, what are you? What are your firm convictions? What conclusions have you drawn from recent Labour history? One of them, unfortunately, seems to be, because a lot of social liberalism around Corbynism, as well as the more kind of statist form of socialism, is that doesn't work. That's toxic. Let's not do that. So it's become more conservative. It's become more authoritarian. And the result, of course, is that he is the most unpopular prime minister since polling began.
Yes.
For various reasons, but nothing seems to be working. And comparing him to all these other Labour prime ministers, they were all at this stage doing better than him, I would say. Ramsay MacDonald at this stage was out of office the first time. But he doesn't, on the league table, he's not doing well.
Although, it's funny, right? If we were to do this in 10 years' time, we hadn't lived through it maybe even, we would then pick at some of the accomplishments that this government is doing quite quietly. And in the same way that we have for New Labour and the same way that we have for the very first Labour administration, we'll say, well, actually, here was some stuff that they did. And if you look around on net zero and on workers' rights and on rental rights, and actually more broadly at sort of like especially the use of the first budget to free up investment, something which everyone has forgotten that Rachel Reeves has done. But it's like a real, like getting out of the headlock of what the fiscal rules entailed and allowing for that kind of aggressive intervention in the market. Quite a socialistic idea, actually. I think there's something quite impressive there. I think actually, and this is symptomatic of how much British politics have changed as much as how Labour has changed, that the idea that markets run efficiently on their own and don't need any intervention is kind of dead. And actually there's a very easy sense, train companies getting nationalised with the kind of, it's barely even news anymore when those franchises come to national ownership. And the same with the idea that, well, actually, we know that the free market is not going to get us to net zero. That's going to require quite aggressive state intervention. So in there, I think there is I think it may be that in the future, this is maybe me at my most optimistic, we would look back on it in the way that we have some of these other Labour governments and gone, they had a torrid fucking time when they were in power. But actually, when you look at it with a bit of distance, there were some genuine accomplishments that took place.
Well, I think one difference, if you compare it to, from 1929 and 1974, is that they don't have the excuse of a minority or a very slim majority. They got a landslide. In other ways, you've got the same problems: hostile press, attacks on the economy, anxious about patriotism, paranoid about disunity, the feeling they squandered this opportunity for radical change at the very beginning. Almost exactly what, New Labour said. Look, the one thing we really regret is that we weren't more radical in that first year. And on the disunity question, I think what they did, and it's really interesting if you compare literally anybody, any other prime minister, they were constantly pulling people in, right? Like Gaitskell and Bevan going at it. Gaitskell wins the leadership. He puts Bevan as shadow foreign secretary.
Interesting.
Right. Blair, not so broad-based, but someone like Robin Cook was relatively left-wing. He was certainly bringing like the soft left.
He knew he had to have John Prescott there. Yeah. He did recognise the value that John Prescott brought to the left of the party. And
There was so much, Michael Foot, amazing at working with, James Callaghan and then, Dennis Healey. And there constantly seems to be this effort. And what, I sort of blame on McSweeneyism really, is this idea that you have to utterly crush the left in an unprecedented way, I think, squeeze them out of having any power or influence whatsoever, thus intensifying that old left-wing dilemma that Nye Bevan talked about, where, do you stay or do you go? And the answer a lot of the time, a lot of people are coming to the conclusion that the Ralph Miliband did. It's just not a socialist party. And you should just, give up. And yet they're still angry with it. That's what I find really interesting is you go, okay, fine, it's not a Marxist party, it's not a socialist, whatever. Well, just leave. Why are you angry with it? It's not your party. But they still feel that it kind of should be. There's a weird cognitive dissonance.
I find this whole history just really quite frustrating in that most of the time, I'm much less sympathetic towards the Labour left than that. I mostly just think you're just wasting our fucking time. And, you end up holding up progress because of a series of doctrinal issues and frankly, a sort of self-interested emotional appeal. However, you have to go through this story just thinking like I'm going all the way back to the 1920s. It was like, the right just of the party, just not, and the centre not being open enough to any of the ideas that come to the left of them, just being completely closed off to them. This is part of the reason that I find that Kinnock election, that final Kinnock election, so heartbreaking. That it's a moment where there's kind of a moment of, well, I might call it synthesis, where actually there's a pretty happy medium there, and it's not just this tribal internal knife fight within the party. And yet those chances are quite rare. Most of this period that we've looked at, these over 100 years, it's mostly about people who share quite broadly a sense of values, just trying to murder each other and being completely unable to learn anything from one another.
Well, my conclusion, I think, is that some of these kind of distinctions that we talk about, where it's just left versus right or purity versus pragmatism, are just way too crude. That's just not how it works. There's always more factions, and then there's kind of philosophical disagreements within factions, right? So that, I think, is one lesson. Two, it is obsessed, haunted by the past. Yeah. It is always trying to sort of, every era of the Labour Party is trying to reckon with the trauma or the mythology of an earlier era.
Yeah. It's so true, isn't it?
It's just haunted like that. And it never really gets over its imposter syndrome. I think maybe Blair, even Blair had it. Like, I think it always gets the feeling it's just like, oh, we shouldn't really be in government.
They're renting power. Yeah. And the Tories have the Tories don't even have a fucking mortgage. The Tories, that's fully owned. They can do what they like and they're going to build an annex.
Could I end on a slightly more uplifting note?
Yes, please.
This is Clement Attlee in 1937. There has never been a time when there were not questionings in the ranks and suggestions of breakaway movements. There has never been a lack of candid criticism of the policy and achievements of the official Labour Party. But despite rumblings on the right and denunciations on the left, the party has continued on its way.
Yes. And we owe so much of the things that we take for granted, whether you go to human rights acts or whether you go to the NHS, to what this party has done. And look, I'm sure, if it wasn't there would be a different progressive party with a different sort of ethos and heritage, and it would have been doing similar things. But it remains, despite all of that, a viable vehicle for winning elections, no matter how many times they think that it's died.
Yep.
And secondly, something that has over and over handed to us significant progressive gains, mostly on days while everyone else was writing editorials about how completely useless it was and how it wouldn't be any harm if it just fucked off and died. Nevertheless, it's done it, and this country would be a far worse place without it.
I think maybe every Labour government looks better in hindsight.
Yeah.
So we just need to wait a little longer, and then people go, Starmer did some things. Well, maybe. We'll find out. Thank you so much for listening to the epic story of the Labour Party and to Origin Story in general.
Patrons, hang about, because we've got the special making of this podcast coming up right now for your listening pleasure.
And if you would like to help us do all the research, which was quite considerable this season, perhaps excessive, grueling, and deeply regretted. But no, it's been wonderful to be able to do this stuff. Thanks to your support. So if you'd like to join us, you can go to patreon.com/Origin Story. And please tell a friend, review us, give us some feedback, post us on social media. Just try and spread the word, because I think this is I think we're very proud of what we're doing with this season and of the feedback we've had so far. Plus, we're getting a new range of merchandise very soon. We've been in the lab working on some new designs, and there'll be another live show in 2026. Details to be confirmed. Is that all our business?
I think so. Let's fuck off.
Bye.